Japan has mostly pursued a cautious line, both militarily and in other areas, since the Second World War. However, Japan is radically revising its pacifist stance. Better known for its pacifist constitution and economic power, Tokyo is now following a roadmap that explicitly militarizes its power. Historic records in defense budgets, massive investments in next-generation technologies, and accelerating exercises with the United States and NATO. This change has been accelerated by rising tensions in the region, and in particular by Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine. Over the years, Japan has taken a mostly cautious line on Russia-related issues. On the surface, relations between Japan and Russia may at times appear to be frozen or characterized by diplomatic niceties. But serious historical disputes and security concerns lie behind the scenes. In particular, the issue of the Northern Territories, or the Southern Kuril Islands as the Russians call them, has been a major obstacle to a peace treaty between the two countries for decades. Japan is now adopting a course that shows that it is not afraid to take the steps that Russia fears the most. In this new era, Japan's diplomatic and military moves in the region are making Moscow nervous at both the Pacific and global levels. First of all, a brief look at history shows that the rivalry between Russia and Japan dates back to the 19th century. Frictions over the sovereignty of regions such as the Kuril Islands and Sakhalin turned into a de facto conflict with the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. At the time, Japan's victory over the Russian Empire upset the balance of power in Asia and showcased Japan as the rising power of the East worldwide. Even after this victory, the rivalry between the two countries never ended. At the end of World War II, the Soviet Union occupied the Kuril Islands, which had been held by Japan, and Japan has been arguing ever since that these islands should be returned to Japan. A formal peace treaty between the two countries has still not been signed. By 2022, Russia's attack on Ukraine also had a shocking impact on Japan. Tokyo sought to shape its most aggressive policy since World War II. But what are these steps? How is Japan transforming its passive post-World War II military to make Moscow so nervous? The Tokyo government has decided to increase defense spending to 2% of the country's GDP by 2027. This represents a historic 60% increase that will result in Japan having the third largest defense budget in the world. In addition to updating its national security policies, Japan is determined to strengthen its relations with Ukraine. Since the beginning of the war, the Japanese government has sent military equipment and humanitarian aid to the country. However, these moves were not strong enough to contain Russian tyranny. In this context, Japan, known for its pacifist stance since World War II, has taken strategic decisions that could completely change the balance of power in Asia. With rising tensions in the region, threats from North Korea, disputes with China and Russia's military build-up, Japan feels it is time to act. So what was Japan's decision? Is building a military alliance in Asia the best way to ensure security in the region? In this video, we look at the radical changes Japan is planning for its defense policy and why it worries leaders like Vladimir Putin. Japan has officially inaugurated an independent mission in the NATO military alliance. Tokyo and NATO are seeking to strengthen cooperation amid growing tensions stemming from Russia, China, and North Korea. Previously, the Japanese embassy in Belgium also covered NATO. The new mission is led by Osamu Izawa, who takes over the role currently held by the ambassador to Belgium, Masahiro Mikami. He replaces Masahiro Mikami as Japan's ambassador to Belgium, representing Tokyo's interests in the military alliance. According to a Foreign Ministry press release, Japan and NATO held high-level talks in Tokyo on January 16, during which security issues in East Asia and Europe were discussed. The talks underscore Japan's growing engagement with NATO, a trend that has accelerated since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and the deepening partnership between Moscow and Beijing. While Japan is not a NATO member, its cooperation with the alliance has grown alongside ties with other Indo-Pacific partners such as Australia, New Zealand, and South Korea. This partly reflects and comes in response to China's growing territorial aggression in East Asia and around the South China Sea. But it also reflects NATO's broader efforts to engage with nations outside its traditional sphere as geopolitical tensions rise. Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba has expressed support for the concept of a NATO-like security framework in Asia, but details have yet to be released. While details are being kept under wraps, there are several key points about the construction of an Asian NATO. Building an Asian version of NATO is not the same as building NATO in Asia. Recent reports that NATO is considering establishing a liaison office in Japan and expanding cooperation with Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand reflect Western concern about China under President Xi Jinping. Russia is also partly located in Asia and has strong relations with China and North Korea. NATO's 31 members are focused on Europe and North America. It serves as a possible model if Asian countries want to establish their own version of the Indo-Pacific region. Which countries might be interested in forming an Asian military alliance? Despite ongoing border disputes with China, India promotes neutrality. Joining an Asian defense alliance would go against New Delhi's policy. The 10 members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations have different views on the United States and China. Membership in an Asian NATO could potentially become a point of contention and threaten the consensus ASEAN is trying to achieve. Any country that becomes a founding member of such an alliance will shape the focus of such an alliance. Would it cover the area covered by the US Navy's 7th Fleet? This would include the Pacific and Indian Oceans and the areas around Australia and Oceania. Even if it is focused exclusively on East Asia, a bitter political tension persists between America's two key allies, South Korea and Japan. As the current administrations in Seoul and Tokyo work to repair the bumpy relationship and build military cooperation, it is difficult to look beyond the long-standing mistrust that still exists between these two countries. There is a question of Taiwan's security. While there are many volatile situations in the Indo-Pacific, China's threat to invade Taiwan has received the most attention. At a recent G-7 leaders summit in Japan, leaders reaffirmed the importance of peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait as an indispensable element for security and prosperity in the international community, and called for a peaceful resolution of cross-strait issues. No country in Asia has formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan. The island's closest security arrangement is with the United States, often referred to in Washington as strategic ambiguity. This means that the US has neither promised nor refused to defend Taiwan if China were to one day invade it. Whether an Asian military alliance should support the US defense of Taiwan will be uppermost in the minds of prospective members. Many may think of NATO only in the context of Article 5 provisions, but NATO activities also include military, intelligence, and other support. NATO membership does not preclude countries from providing similar support to those outside the group. Just as the US, European, and Asian states currently support Ukraine in the absence of a mutual defense treaty, countries in Asia are free to build deterrence and share material support before and during conflict. The United States will continue to deepen its partnerships in Asia. Allies such as Japan, South Korea, and Australia will also seek to deepen their security partnerships in Asia and Europe. China will also seek security partners. Despite these efforts, there is no Asian NATO on the horizon. Even if the conditions for creating an Asian NATO give some version of Article 5 less momentum, Japan's pacifist constitution, India's strategic neutrality, and the complex relations between Asian countries limit what potential members can bring to such an alliance. The US already has mutual defense treaties with several Asian countries. The absence of a NATO counterpart in Asia does not mean that deterrence cannot be strengthened, or that countries in Asia cannot provide support to each other and other allies in the event of conflict. Expect to see more agreements in Asia that enhance security cooperation between US partners and allies, including research and development, information sharing, and combat readiness. But China has often criticized NATO's interaction with its Indo-Pacific partners, warning against the establishment of a similar alliance in the region. Beijing sees such moves as an extension of US-led efforts to limit its influence, raising concerns about an arms race or further division in the region. Japan's relationship with Russia also continues to deteriorate. Once characterized by economic cooperation and dialogue over a series of Japanese islands known as the Northern Territories in Japan and the Kuril Islands in Moscow, relations have recently been strained by Tokyo's compliance with Western sanctions against Moscow and Tokyo's support for Ukraine. Why is Japan taking a more prominent role in supporting Ukraine? Japan has a long and difficult history with Russia. In 1945, Russia occupied several islands northeast of Hokkaido, evicting long-time Japanese residents and settling Russians. This territorial dispute dominated Russo-Japanese relations from the end of World War II until the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. The two sides never signed a formal peace treaty, and both the Japanese elite and public opinion were highly negative towards the Soviet Union and Russia. They saw them as unreliable, militaristic, and expansionist. Former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo spent a lot of political capital to improve relations and sign a peace treaty. The geostrategic logic was China-centered. If Russo-Japanese relations were improved, Sino-Russian relations would weaken. Despite Abe offering economic and territorial concessions and meeting Vladimir Putin more than 25 times, the policy failed. As part of this diplomatic effort, Japan granted Russia a rite of passage following its annexation of Crimea in 2014. This helps to make it clear that Ukraine is not really the issue. What matters for Japan is the impact of the invasion on global norms against territorial conquest, and, in particular, how a violation of these norms could increase the likelihood of Chinese aggression against Taiwan. Has Japan's response to the conflict led to strengthened alliances and small-scale agreements among like-minded countries in the Indo-Pacific region? Japan's security elites see China as an existential threat. If China annexes Taiwan, the resulting conflict could escalate to the level of a regional or global war. Even if it does not do so, China's control over Taiwan would significantly weaken Japan's security posture. The failure to prevent the invasion of Ukraine is seen as a failure of deterrence. Japan has therefore sought to strengthen deterrence not only by acquiring new military capabilities, but also by deepening the alliance with the United States, developing new and existing partnerships, and generally demonstrating its resolve. However, US political instability and growing isolationist sentiments raised fears that the United States was an unreliable partner. Therefore, before the invasion, Japan was diversifying its partners under the vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific. This vision aims to develop security ties with states that fear China's regional hegemony. India, Australia, and some ASEAN states, notably Vietnam and the Philippines. Despite India's proximity to Russia, the Quadrilateral Centre emerged on the scene. This Quadrilateral Centre consists of India, Australia, Japan, and the United States. Japan and Australia, in particular, share the same regional security outlook, and their long-standing quasi-alliance seems to be evolving into a virtual alliance. Most recently, Japan and South Korea normalized their bilateral security relations after several years of deep freeze. However, given the fragile nature of relations between the two countries, it is difficult to say what this means and whether it will continue. While Japan generally aims to diversify its regional partners within the framework of its alliance with the US, it is also hedging against US withdrawal. What are Japan's most important direct or indirect contributions to Ukraine through arms sales, international leadership, or possible post-conflict reconstruction commitments? While Japan lagged behind in enforcing sanctions after Russia's annexation of Crimea, it did not hesitate to do so after the invasion of Ukraine. This included financial sanctions, blacklists of individuals and organizations, and trade restrictions not only on Russia and Russian firms, but also on firms in China, India, and other countries seen as supporting the Russian invasion. Japan has reduced imports of Russian hydrocarbons, as has the European Union. It has also sent humanitarian aid supplies to Ukraine, including medicine, generators, food and military equipment ranging from bulletproof vests to surveillance drones. Moreover, Japan circumvented domestic restrictions on arms exports by sending Patriot missiles to the United States so that the US could continue to supply them to Ukraine. In total, Japan has committed over $12 billion. Japan has also deepened its relations with the EU and NATO. With Japan identified as NATO's closest ally, the Tokyo government has attended several NATO summits. While symbolically meaningful, NATO-Japan security cooperation has clear limits. While Japan's primary concern is China, NATO fears Russian expansionism. However, making East Asian security an issue for NATO is part of Japan's deterrence strategy to increase the risk of a tougher European economic response to Chinese aggression against Taiwan. Again, Japan's response to Ukraine should be understood through the prism of East Asian security rather than the realities of the invasion. What are the implications for Japan of the recent signing of a mutual defense pact between Russia and North Korea? And was Japan's strong support for Ukraine a factor in this development? North Korea has long been Japan's nightmare. The Kim regime is seen as an evil and brutal dictatorship that periodically threatens Japan with nuclear annihilation. Missile tests regularly fly over the Japanese main islands, triggering alarms in various locations. It has historically abducted Japanese citizens from the Sea of Japan and brought them to North Korea to serve as interpreters, teachers, and other professionals. Given North Korea's pariah status, even China has kept its distance. While China understands that military aid would seriously damage relations with both South Korea and Japan and destabilize the region, it continues to support the Kim regime economically. Tokyo was shocked by Russia's pledge of assistance to North Korea's missile program, which is largely Japan's main concern. As for Russian motivations, it is hard to say that the Mutual Defense Pact is aimed at Japan. The basic reciprocity was aid in exchange for shells and missiles. Russia's goal was to replenish supplies. Even if Japan had not reacted to the invasion of Ukraine, Russia would have acted in its own interests. Moscow has no history of taking Japanese interests into account, to put it mildly. However, given that it generally seeks to create instability and chaos among its rivals, the results probably pleased Russia. Unlike its Western partners, there is little domestic opposition to Japan's response. The ruling Liberal Democratic Party has been in power almost uninterrupted since 1955 and continuously since 2012. For the moment at least, it is unchallenged. Moreover, foreign and security policy debates in Japan are minimal. Given that its response to the invasion was mainly aimed at deterring China, and given that China is seen as a fundamental threat by the security elite, Japan is likely to continue its support for Ukraine. It will continue to develop its own capabilities and deepen regional partnerships for the foreseeable future. This does not mean that Japan can do whatever it wants. Still, both Japan and NATO oppose revisionist countries trying to change the status quo by force. Given their strengthening ties, what can we expect the two to do to cooperate if a conflict over Taiwan or another war envelops Europe? Economically, and possibly through the European Union or individual states, Japan and Europe could use their economic power to impose sanctions on selected organizations, trade activities, and investments. They could freeze credit and access to the global banking system for individuals and the aggressor country's banks, and pass laws prohibiting the aggressor country's companies from doing business in their countries. Diplomatically, the two can name and shame states and isolate them in the court of public opinion, working to shape world opinion against aggressors. Making it harder for leaders of an aggressor country to travel abroad through visa restrictions also contributes to pariah status. Imposing restrictions on access to one's airspace and transportation can be an even more severe application of this pressure. Closer to operational support, Japan and NATO could cooperate in cyber, space, and disinformation. For example, building on long-standing cybersecurity cooperation, including Japan's participation in NATO's cyber defense exercise and the Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence in Estonia. They could exchange information on deployment networks, tactics, and cooperative responses. In space, since today's networks of communications, navigation, and command and control systems are all interconnected by space-based systems. Japan and NATO can work to improve the resilience of their satellites to interference and spoofing. They can also work to integrate their separate space domain awareness capabilities to provide greater situational awareness for United States-led activities. And with disinformation, the two sides could exchange information on any known disinformation campaigns against them and other like-minded countries, and quickly identify and respond to disinformation campaigns. The faster like-minded countries can share information, the better they can coordinate a proactive response. In the longer term, they can jointly develop technology to better recognize disinformation attacks. All these opportunities for cooperation show that the decades-long effort to strengthen Japan-NATO cooperation promises a tangible impact in a future conflict. That is, it helps raise the costs for aggressors trying to disrupt the status quo by force. This does not guarantee that aggressors will not act, but it does promise real costs that can be borne immediately. Japan did this when Russia invaded Ukraine. NATO could do something similar if China invades Taiwan. By continuing to strengthen bilateral relations today, Japan and NATO are positioning themselves to threaten real consequences if necessary. The more they both work together in peacetime, the more credible their threats will appear when a conflict breaks out. So, what do you think about this issue? We would be grateful if you could tell us in the comments. Thank you for watching us. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and like to support us.